Donald Trump reposted a video showing Barack and Michelle Obama as apes. And what made this moment different from the countless other controversies he has generated online over the past decade is not simply that people were offended, because that has become almost routine at this point, but that members of his own party immediately stepped forward and said publicly and without much hedging that this was racist, damaging, and politically dangerous. Late Thursday night on Truth Social, Trump shared a 1-minute video pushing familiar false claims about the 2020 election, and nearly a minute in, almost as if it were deliberately planted to maximize shock value, the clip suddenly cut to a doctored image portraying the Obamas as apes, paired with the "Lion sleeps tonight," which by Friday morning had triggered a level of backlash that even longtime observers of Trump's media strategy recognized as unusually intense. Within hours, Senator Tim Scott said he was praying the video was fake because it was the most racist thing he had seen come out of the White House. Congressman Mike Lawler called it incredibly offensive, and Senator Pete Ricketts said that any reasonable person could recognize the racist context. Statements that stood out precisely because for nearly a decade, the standard Republican response to Trump controversies has been to deflect, minimize, reinterpret, or simply remain silent. At first, the White House attempted to dismiss the post as internet humor, then shifted blame to an unnamed staffer for sharing it. And finally, they just removed the video entirely without any fanfare, a sequence that in political organizations almost always signals that internal damage assessments have concluded that retreat is less costly than continued defense. Welcome to Why It's Trending Daily. I'm Hank. This is where I break down the stories that everyone is suddenly Googling, and I explain to you why they matter. Now, when you step back and look at this story honestly, it is not primarily about one offensive clip, and it's not even mainly about whether the video crossed a moral line, which it clearly did. But it's about political risk in the moment when Trump's online behavior stopped being a net asset and started becoming a liability for people who have to win difficult elections in competitive districts. For years, Trump's outrage-driven media strategy worked remarkably well, keeping him permanently at the center of attention, dominating news cycles, energizing supporters, and intimidating critics, forcing his own party to orbit around him because on balance, the chaos generated more power than it destroyed. Republican officials tolerated the turbulence because it delivered turnout and fundraising and media relevance, and because any short-term discomfort could usually be justified by long-term electoral gains. That equilibrium, however, is clearly shifting. The lawmakers who spoke out here did not suddenly develop different values in 2026. They reacted because they are facing suburban swing voters, donor scrutiny, and increasingly thin margins where every viral controversy turns into negative advertising, nervous fundraising calls, and exhausting explanations to constituents who are already tired of the constant drama. When Tim Scott speaks up, it matters because he represents the party's effort to broaden its appeal beyond its core base. When Mike Lawler speaks up, it matters because he is fighting for survival in a highly competitive district. And when Pete Ricketts speaks up, it matters because he reflects donor class anxiety. These are not symbolic gestures here. These are practical warnings in real time. These are politicians signaling that the cost of defending Trump's behavior is beginning to outweigh the benefit. Timing also plays a crucial role here, because this controversy erupted just as Trump's name resurfaced in the newly released Epstein-related files, which immediately created uncomfortable headlines and renewed scrutiny that his team would have preferred to avoid. Trump has always been highly skilled at redirecting narratives when something threatens him politically, often by creating a new controversy that overwhelms the media ecosystem and forces attention elsewhere, a tactic that has worked repeatedly well for him over the years. Misdirection, however, only functions when allies are willing to participate in it. This time, however, they were not. Instead of rallying around him, they distanced themselves, which is far more consequential than any single critical statement because it signals the beginning of strategic recalculation. When allies stop defending you reflexively, power begins to erode quietly rather than dramatically, through small decisions that rarely make headlines at first. Campaign managers start limiting appearances. Donors begin hedging their bets. Party leaders quietly adjust schedules. And strategists start preparing contingency plans. No one really announces these shifts publicly. They just kind of adapt and happen. And over time, the center of gravity kind of moves. The administration's response further underscores this reality, because the inconsistent explanations revealed internal panic rather than confidence, as genuinely harmless controversies are typically met with unified messaging rather than improvisation. If the leadership truly believed this was inconsequential, they would have defended it consistently instead of cycling through multiple narratives before just deleting it. That tells you that senior advisors understood immediately that this was hurting them. It is also important to acknowledge that none of this behavior is exactly new. Trump's history of racially charged messaging, provocative symbolism, and inflammatory rhetoric stretches back years, from birtherism to selective retweets to visual memes designed to provoke outrage, and it has often been tolerated or even rewarded. What has changed, though, is not the behavior, but the environment. The electorate is more polarized. Turnout margins are thinner. Donor networks are more cautious. Legal exposure is higher, and media ecosystems are way less forgiving, which means actions that once energized supporters now carry far heavier downside risk. Political systems always respond to math before morality, and the math here is shifting. There is also a generational and institutional component to this moment as well, because younger operatives and newer donors and emerging leaders are less emotionally invested in Trump's dominance and more focused on building sustainable coalitions that can survive beyond one personality. For them, repeated controversies are not proof of strength, but evidence of instability. And instability is expensive. And this does not mean Trump is finished, irrelevant, or powerless. In fact, far from it. He remains the most influential figure in Republican politics with an unmatched ability to command attention and mobilize supporters. But influence is not binary. It exists on a spectrum. And this episode suggests that Trump is slowly moving from unquestioned authority toward contested leadership. That transition, if it continues, will not happen through dramatic rebellions or public coups, but through gradual withdrawals of unconditional loyalty. More caveats. More distance, more quiet resistance. And that is how dominant political figures lose control in modern day systems. Not through defeat, but through friction. Now, this episode also matters because it sets a precedent. Once party leaders publicly treat certain behavior as unacceptable, even sporadically, they establish boundaries that did not previously exist, and boundaries tend to expand over time. What is tolerated today shapes what is possible tomorrow. Now, if this moment marks the beginning of limits, even soft ones, on Trump's online conduct, it will affect how campaigns are run, how messaging is managed, and how much autonomy he ultimately retains. So this story is not about a meme, it's about leverage. It's about whether Trump still controls the incentive structure of his party or whether that structure is beginning to shift away from him right now. And the early signs suggest that, for the first time in years, the shift is real. The next few months will tell us whether this was an isolated embarrassment that fades quickly or the opening chapter of a broader recalibration inside the Republican Party. I'm Hank, here to explain the chaos, not hype it. If you want clarity instead of noise, you're in the right place.